The majestic pyramids on the Giza Plateau, west of modern Cairo, are perhaps the most recognizable and impressive symbol not only of ancient Egypt, but of all ancient human history. They are rightfully considered the only one of the so-called seven wonders of the ancient world to have survived to the present day, having endured millennia of wars, earthquakes, and destructive human activity. The legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, if they ever existed as described by ancient authors, vanished without a trace from the face of the earth. On the site of the gigantic Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, today one can only see scattered ruins and a lone column. The Colossus of Rhodes and the statue of Zeus at Olympia were destroyed. The lighthouse of Alexandria collapsed into the sea. But the Giza pyramids remain as unshakable, majestic, and enigmatic as on that distant day 4,500 years ago, when the last workers left their construction sites. Of the three main pyramids built on the Giza Plateau by the pharaohs of the powerful Fourth Dynasty of the Old Kingdom, the earliest in construction, the northernmost, and undoubtedly the largest and most famous, is the Great Pyramid, built for King Khufu, whom the Greek historian Herodotus called Cheops. It is this pyramid, as the most perfect and grandiose creation of the Pyramid Age, that has rightfully earned the most meticulous and unflagging attention from ancient travelers and pilgrims, as well as from modern scholars, engineers, mystics, and the simply curious. The scale of this structure is truly astounding even today in the age of skyscrapers. For the construction of this gigantic, almost monolithic structure with a perfectly square base, whose area is more than 5.26 hectares, or 13 acres, about 2,300,000 huge stone blocks were used, according to various estimates, mainly local limestone, each weighing on average more than 1 ton, and some granite blocks in the inner chambers reaching tens of tons. As the simplest arithmetic calculations show, if all these blocks were laid sequentially, one after another, the ancient builders would have had at their disposal only about 2 minutes for the quarrying, transportation, fitting, and placement of each individual block, and this provided they worked continuously for 10 hours a day, without days off or breaks, throughout all the 20-odd years of Khufu's reign, which is dated to approximately 2545 to 2525 BCE. The original height of Khufu's pyramid, including the now lost granite pyramidion, was 146.6 meters, or 481 feet. It remained the tallest man-made structure in the world for an incredibly long time, almost 44 centuries, until the famous Eiffel Tower was built in Paris in 1889 CE. Despite its truly colossal dimensions, Khufu's Great Pyramid was erected, and, even more surprisingly, oriented to the cardinal points with simply astonishing, almost supernatural precision for that time. Its four faces deviate from true, astronomical north by only 1/20th of a degree, meaning the error is less than 3 arc minutes. Achieving such orientation accuracy for a gigantic structure without modern instruments was an incredibly complex task. It seems that no other ancient structure in the world throws down such an audacious challenge to all our notions of the capabilities of ancient technologies, to all the arguments of modern engineering reason, as Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. Therefore, it is not at all surprising that over the centuries, a great multitude of diverse hypotheses, conjectures, and outright speculations have arisen and continue to arise concerning its creation, its design, and especially its original purpose. Countless theories have been proposed attempting to explain the numerous mysteries and enigmas of this unique pyramid, ranging from quite scientific but controversial ones, for example, about various construction methods using ramps or internal tunnels through alternative but technically possible ones, for example, the hypothesis that some pyramid blocks might have been made not from solid stone, but from an ancient variety of geopolymer concrete, and ending with frankly fantastical and absurd ones, for example, that multi-ton stone blocks were moved and lifted to great heights using levitation, anti-gravity, or the energy of some mysterious sound waves. And according to proponents of pseudoscientific theories, the Great Pyramid supposedly owes its truly colossal dimensions, ideal mathematical proportions, and incredible construction precision not to human genius and labor at all, but to the intervention of some higher powers or an entire army of extraordinary beings, either wise fugitives from lost Atlantis or powerful aliens from another planet. And yet, as often happens in history, the authentic truth sometimes turns out to be far more surprising, complex, and interesting than any of the boldest fictions and fantasies. If some incredible, almost superhuman force was indeed involved in the creation of Khufu's Great Pyramid, allowing this grandiose plan to be realized, it was by no means the intelligence of aliens from space or the magic of Atlanteans, but above all, the iron, unbending will of one man, one earthly ruler who considered himself a god, multiplied by the perfectly organized power of the entire Egyptian state of the Old Kingdom. It was precisely under Khufu and his father Sneferu that the cardinal change in the very ideology of royal power occurred, which made the construction of such gigantic monuments possible and necessary. This change had a completely special, fundamental significance not only for architecture, but for all of Egyptian civilization as a whole. And to better understand its prehistory and essence, we first need to mentally transport ourselves one generation back to the time of the reign of Khufu's father, Pharaoh Sneferu, the founder of the Fourth Dynasty. The ancient Egyptians' passion for creating monumental stone structures designed for eternity has a very long history which, as we now know, dates back to the prehistoric megalithic complex at Nabta Playa, dated to the 5th millennium BCE. The first truly large stone structure in the Nile Valley was, apparently, the underground burial chamber in the tomb of King Khasekemwy at Abydos, erected at the very end of the Second Dynasty. The first entirely stone pyramid, although stepped in form, was built for King Dahshur at Saqqara, at the beginning of the Third Dynasty, by his brilliant architect Imhotep. But the first pyramid, with a correct, geometrically smooth pyramidal form, was only built under Pharaoh Sneferu, who reigned approximately from 2575 to 2545 BCE. Sneferu was the founder of the powerful Fourth Dynasty and father of Khufu himself. He turned out to be not only one of the greatest builders in all of Egyptian history, erecting for himself 3 gigantic pyramids, one at Meidum and 2 at Dahshur, but also, apparently, an important religious and ideological reformer. It was precisely the transition to the construction of true pyramids under Sneferu that marked a fundamentally new stage in the development not only of funerary architecture, but also in the very relations between the pharaoh and his subjects, in the ideology of royal power, and not simply another technical improvement in the long architectural evolution of pyramids, or some change in the details of conceptions about the pharaoh's afterlife. As often happened in the long and conservative Egyptian history, the important changes that occurred under Sneferu in the ideology and status of the ruler found their clear reflection in the official royal titulary. As his main Horus name, that is, the oldest, most sacred, and symbolically most significant element of the pharaoh's throne name, Sneferu chose the name Neb-Maat. The literal meaning of this name is Lord of Maat, or Master of Maat. Maat, as we recall, was for the ancient Egyptians not just a goddess, but also a fundamental concept personifying truth, justice, harmony, world order, and correct behavior. Therefore, the title Lord of Maat had a very deep meaning and little relation to simple earthly justice. In the complex cosmological system of the ancient Egyptians, Maat was the personification of the very foundation of being, established by the gods at the creation of the model of the universe, which the pharaoh was obliged to maintain. It is important to note that the Egyptian word Neb, translated as lord or master, also means owner, proprietor, holder. Thus, by adopting the title Neb-Mat, Sneferu not only declared his adherence to truth and justice, but, as it were, proclaimed himself the sole and absolute owner and guarantor of all the existing world order. In this way, Sneferu effectively laid the foundations for a new, even more elevated type of divine monarchy. From then on, to rule for the pharaoh meant not only to exercise power and administer justice in the name of the gods, but to be himself the source and embodiment of supreme truth and law. The royal word became absolute law, as the king himself now claimed to embody Ma'at itself, the divine law itself. The king's power, previously quite earthly, acquired an even more powerful divine halo. It became absolutely untouchable. This was probably the effect that the ambitious pharaoh Sneferu sought. To further enhance this very bold ideological claim of his divine essence, Sneferu, apparently, was the first of the Egyptian kings to adopt and widely use another new and very important royal title, Netjer Nefer, which literally means simply, perfect God or good God. But in reality, did the common subjects of Sneferu and his successors see a real God in their earthly king? Or was it just an official title, flattery of courtiers, and an element of state propaganda? For all of human history is full of countless examples in which tyrants and dictators, afflicted with megalomania and unlimited power, appropriated the most flattering and high-sounding epithets, such as Father of the People, Savior of the EB, Fatherland, or Beloved Leader, which in reality turned out to be just empty words, covering up the fear and hatred of the subjects. The experience of recent 20th century history convincingly proves to us that all these grandiloquent titles and personality cults most often did not reflect genuine popular love and respect at all, but were merely an integral part of official, totalitarian propaganda, concealing a cruel reality. Despite this, many Egyptologists, especially in the past, often still ignored this point, so obvious to modern man, and tended to take the official ideology of the Old Kingdom at face value when it came to ancient Egypt. This is what, for example, one of the most authoritative and recognized Western experts on the history of the Pyramid Age writes in his well-known book, "The population of Egypt at that time sincerely and unanimously supported the existing political and social order." And later he notes with surprise, "The fact of the almost total absence in the state apparatus of the Old Kingdom of such an obvious organ of coercion as the police is striking." Such a completely rosy and idyllic picture of life in Egypt during the time of pyramid construction seems, to put it mildly, extremely unconvincing and unrealistic. Unless Egypt under the pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty was that ideal utopia that humanity never achieved either before or after, if the head of state officially proclaims himself perfect God, then any open resistance to him, or even simple disagreement with his will, becomes not only reckless and life-threatening, but also practically unthinkable from a religious point of view, a sacrilegious act. And it is not surprising that in the official records and texts of the time that have come down to us, there are practically no mentions of abuses of power, popular discontent, or the use of violence by the state, as all chronicle writing and the creation of any written documents were also under the strictest control of the king and his administration. And only thanks to the impartial data of archaeology, the study of tombs, settlements, human remains, do we have the opportunity to glimpse, at least in part, the more complex and, probably, much harsher truth of that distant era. During the first 3 dynasties of pharaohs, in the period of the early dynastic period and the beginning of the Old Kingdom, many remnants of the distant prehistoric past were still preserved in Egyptian society and culture. In material culture, for example, in the forms and decoration of pottery, stone vessels, and even in the style of early sculpture, forms and traditions inherited from the preceding pre-dynastic period of Naqada still dominated or were very strong. Ancient cities, which arose even during the period of state formation, such as Unet or Dendera, Nekheb or Elkab, Cheni or Thinis, Abydos, Nubet or Naqada, and Nekhen or Hierakonpolis, remained large and influential regional centers with their local cults and traditions. The country's population was still firmly united by strong traditional social ties, such as kinship, family, community, and territory, and perhaps even retained some remnants of the ancient tribal structure. The situation, however, began to change radically with the beginning of the reign of the powerful Fourth Dynasty, approximately from 2575 BCE. A completely new, unified, and much stricter and more refined style was now established at the royal court in Memphis for all types of craft production: pottery, stone vessels, furniture, jewelry, and especially for official royal and private sculpture, created in the central royal workshops. This new capital style quickly spread throughout the country, displacing local provincial traditions. The central government began to actively found new cities and administrative centers, which gradually replaced the old traditional centers of power and influence in the provinces. For example, in Unet, modern Dendera, the administrative center of the Thinite nome was moved from ancient Cheni. The great city of Thebes gradually absorbed and overshadowed its ancient neighbor, Nubt, or Naqada, and the city of Geba, or Edfu, definitively relegated the even more ancient Hierakonpolis, or Nekhen, to a secondary role. There is a certain temptation to consider all these changes not as random events, but as part of a single, carefully planned, and consistently implemented government policy, the main goal of which was the final liquidation of the remnants of local autonomies and traditional centers of power with their subsequent complete subordination to the single administrative center in Memphis. The all-pervading and omnipotent presence of the king and his authority was now felt even in such an intimate and conservative sphere as funerary rites. From then on, any noble Egyptian, regardless of his wealth and status, dreamed of being buried not in his ancestral or local cemetery, next to the graves of his ancestors, as was customary before, but of receiving the great honor of being buried in the new and grandiose royal necropolis of Giza, or Saqqara, in immediate proximity, literally in the shadow of the gigantic tomb of his divine lord. This was considered the highest reward and a guarantee of a prosperous posthumous existence. One of the first royal cemeteries of this new type, which marked the beginning of the Pyramid era, appeared, as we know, not in Giza, but somewhat further south, in Meidum, right at the entrance to the fertile Fayum oasis. The very choice of this new site, previously unused for royal burials, is quite remarkable. Consciously breaking with the centuries-old tradition of burying royalty either in ancient Abydos, as during the First and late Second Dynasties, or in the capital necropolis of Saqqara, as at the beginning of the Second and during the Third Dynasty, Pharaoh Sneferu, founder of the new Fourth Dynasty, with this step symbolically distanced himself from all his predecessors and from their entire legacy. He probably considered himself the founder of a completely new era, a progressive figure under whom royal power would be completely free from the influence of the past, from old traditions and limitations. Consequently, to assert his new status and ideology, he urgently needed to create a monumental funerary structure that, by its size, form, and perfection, would absolutely eclipse everything created in Egypt before, including even the famous Sneferu, Pyramid of Djoser. It was precisely to the realization of this grandiose and unprecedented task that Sneferu's architects and builders in Meidum dedicated themselves. They took as a basis the already proven stepped form of Djoser's pyramid, but significantly improved and enlarged it. In other respects, the new Meidum pyramid surpassed its famous predecessor in every way. It was almost half as tall as Djoser's pyramid. Its original height was about 92 meters, and it had not 6, but 8 huge steps, built of local limestone. Furthermore, when designing the funerary complex at Meidum, it was decided to completely abandon the previous tradition of locating all accompanying funerary structures, such as the temple, courtyards, and chapels, directly at the foot of the step pyramid itself, within a single enclosure, as was the case with Djoser. Instead, Sneferu's architects for the first time applied a new linear layout for the entire complex, in which its various functional elements were arranged strictly sequentially on a single straight axis, oriented from east to west. This axis began at the Nile Valley, where on the border with the arable lands, the so-called Lower or Valley Temple was erected, serving as the entrance to the complex and a place for conducting initial funerary rituals. From there to the west, towards the pyramid itself, led a long paved and covered causeway. And at the eastern foot of the pyramid itself was a small upper, or mortuary, temple, where the main funerary cult of the deceased king was to be performed. This fundamental departure from the previous north-south orientation of royal tombs, so characteristic of the Third Dynasty tombs, including Djoser's pyramid, was undoubtedly deeply logical and ideologically significant. Pharaoh Sneferu's final journey to his tomb and his posthumous journey to the afterlife were now to symbolically repeat the daily path of the great sun, god Ra, across the celestial vault. From his rising on the eastern horizon to his setting on the western horizon. Being now officially proclaimed perfect god, King Sneferu openly and unequivocally identified himself with this supreme celestial deity, giver of life to all that exists. Thus, the solar cult was born, which would become dominant in the ideology of the Old Kingdom. However, for the incredibly ambitious and active pharaoh Sneferu, even this grandiose and innovative structure at Meidum apparently was not enough. Towards the end of approximately the 10th or 15th year of his reign, when the construction of the tall 8-stepped pyramid at Meidum was already nearing completion or had even been completed, a new, even bolder, and no less grandiose architectural concept was born in him. For its realization, he chose a completely different location, situated about 40 kilometers north of Meidum, an extensive desert plateau in the area known today as Dahshur. Dahshur was on the southernmost border of the great Memphite necropolis, but before Sneferu, there had been no royal burials there. Perhaps it was a simple coincidence, but from the Dahshur plateau, Djoser's distant step pyramid at Saqqara was clearly visible, as if challenging the new ruler. It was here, in Dahshur, that Sneferu decided to build not just another step pyramid, but the first true, correct pyramid in the history of Egypt and the world, with smooth, sloping faces, which by its perfection and size was to definitively overshadow all previous achievements and serve as an eternal and unambiguous reminder to all of the advent of a new great era, which he, Sneferu, had inaugurated with his reign. The somewhat archaic and hidden solar symbolism of the Meidum step pyramid was now to be replaced by a much more explicit and monumental visual representation of the very sunbeam frozen in stone, executed in the form of a gigantic and perfectly smooth stone structure of pyramidal form. Even the very name that Sneferu gave to this, his second Dahshur pyramid, the shining or manifested structure of Sneferu, is a clear allusion to the radiance of the rising or midday sun, the sun of a new era of power and prosperity for Egypt. For the construction of this new, conceptually revolutionary pyramid, a vast area of about 8.5 acres was cleared and leveled. It was initially intended that the height of this pyramid would be about 500 feet. That is, more than 150 meters, with a very steep angle of inclination of the faces at 60 degrees, which would make it the tallest and most impressive structure in the world. The project also envisaged the construction of a small satellite pyramid nearby, probably intended for the Ki, that is, the pharaoh's spirit double, as well as the construction of a complete complex of mortuary buildings according to the new Meidum scheme, a small upper temple at the eastern foot of the pyramid, a long paved causeway leading down to the valley, and a large lower, or valley, temple on the border with the arable lands, intended for performing the king's mortuary cult and receiving offerings. Financing such unprecedentedly large-scale and costly construction as the erection of 2, and, as it later turned out, even 3, gigantic pyramids, as well as ensuring the uninterrupted supply of everything necessary for the royal mortuary cult for all time, required the state to have a perfectly tuned and extremely efficient system of economic management and resource collection from the entire country. And Sneferu, it seems, succeeded in this as well. An inscription on the already familiar Palermo stone, dating to the 14th year of Sneferu's reign, reports, for example, the one-time construction, or founding by him, of 35 new large royal estates, or manors, with a full staff of dependent workers or slaves attached to them, as well as 122 large state-owned livestock farms. Most of these new state enterprises were concentrated, apparently, in the vast and fertile, but perhaps not yet fully developed, expanses of the Nile Delta. Archaeological excavations of one such settlement of that time, Imu, modern Qom el-Hisn, located in the western part of the delta, show that its population subsequently grew significantly in size, which may indicate a general improvement in the demographic situation and an economic upswing during the Fourth Dynasty, at least in some regions. Still, despite the clear increase in state livestock, as shown by studies of bone remains from settlements of common people of that time, their own meat diet remained extremely meager. This allows us to assume with considerable confidence that the overwhelming majority of livestock raised on state farms was intended not for the sustenance of the local population, but exclusively for the needs of the royal court, for supplying the pyramid builders, and for abundant sacrifices in the numerous temples located near the capital, Memphis. The common peasants and shepherds of the delta themselves, as in other eras, were forced to subsist mainly on meager plant-based food, bread, beer, vegetables. It is not even excluded that the grains grown in large quantities on state estates like Imu were mainly used not for human consumption, but as feed for this very state livestock. Here is another vivid example of that selfishness and disregard for the needs of the common people that were so characteristic of the policy of the Egyptian pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. We are presented with a picture of harsh despotism in its, perhaps, worst economic manifestation, when the resources of the entire country are directed to satisfying the needs of a narrow ruling elite and to realizing its ambitious ideological projects. The inhabitants of the Delta, as we see, mainly raised livestock for the state, while other royal estates, located both in Lower and Upper Egypt, specialized in the mass cultivation of grain crops. The main such crop was, of course, barley, from which the main food product, bread, was baked, and the national drink, beer, was brewed. The successful development of agriculture in Egypt was always favored by an exceptionally benign solar climate, and, most importantly, by the predictable and fertile annual Nile floods. Peasants usually began sowing in early autumn, immediately after the floodwaters had completely receded from the fields, leaving behind a layer of moist and fertilized silt. In this ideal soil, the seeds quickly sprouted evenly. A significant part of the plant growth and vegetation period then fell during the relatively cool and humid winter months. The ripe grain harvest was usually gathered in early summer, in April-May, just before the start of the next Nile flood. Then this unchanging annual agricultural cycle repeated itself over and over, year after year, century after century. In such exceptionally favorable natural conditions, obtaining a significant surplus harvest beyond what was necessary for the sustenance of the peasants themselves and for seeds for the next year was relatively easy. However, as we have already said above, most of this surplus harvest was immediately seized by the all-seeing and all-powerful state in the form of heavy taxes in kind. The final result of all this complex economic activity, the centralized accumulation and use of the country's resources for the needs of the royal cult, is very graphically depicted on the magnificently preserved reliefs of the Lower Valley Temple of Sneferu's second pyramid at Dahshur. A long wall frieze here depicts a majestic procession of women, representing personifications of various royal estates and nomes from all over the country. Each of these women carries on her head or in her hands rich gifts, food, drinks, textiles, intended for the eternal provision of King Sneferu's own mortuary cult. The figures of each of these estate women are provided with hieroglyphic inscriptions with the names of the corresponding royal manors or administrative districts they personify. Thus, King Sneferu made it perfectly clear to all his subjects that the construction of his gigantic pyramid and the provision of his eternal funerary cult were not just his personal affair, but a most important national popular undertaking, too, which absolutely all his subjects from all ends of the country had to contribute their share, whether they actually liked it or not. However powerful Pharaoh Sneferu was, however perfect his administrative system and engineering calculations, nature itself ultimately proved stronger than his ambitions. Its irresistible destructive force unexpectedly manifested itself when the first of his Dahshur pyramids, the one that was to become the first true pyramid with steep slopes, was already half-built. Suddenly, its outer casing of white limestone began to be covered with numerous and rapidly growing cracks, especially in the lower part. This was a sure and very alarming sign of the uneven subsidence that had begun in the entire gigantic structure. The sand, and especially the layers of shale clay, the so-called tafla, on which the foundation of this enormous and heavy stone construction rested, turned out to be insufficiently strong and unable to withstand the ever-increasing monstrous load of the pyramid under construction. Due to this unforeseen geological problem, the builders had to urgently make changes to the project. At the very base of the pyramid, they had to lay additional rows of masonry with a smaller angle of inclination to widen the base and reduce the pressure on the ground. However, it was apparently already too late. Deep cracks also appeared in the internal structures of the pyramid, covering the walls of its corridors and burial chambers. The ancient builders desperately tried to combat these dangerous cracks by all available means. They filled them with gypsum mortar, applied additional plaster to the walls, and installed new stone lining inside the chambers. They even used powerful wooden props made of very expensive and rare imported Lebanese cedar to reinforce the vaults. According to an entry on the Palermo stone, at this very time, 40 ships loaded with choice coniferous timber arrived in Egypt from the Phoenician port of Byblos. But since even all these emergency measures were insufficient to stop the destruction, the builders, probably under threat of severe punishment from the enraged pharaoh, made a last desperate attempt to save at least the pyramid itself and their heads along with it. For this purpose, at about mid-height of the structure, the original construction plan was completely and sharply revised, and the angle of inclination of the upper faces of the pyramid was significantly reduced, from the initial almost 55 degrees to a much gentler angle of 43 degrees. Since the technique of inward-sloping masonry of stone blocks, used up to that point in construction and inherited from step pyramids, as it turned out, created excessive lateral pressure on the base of the pyramid and contributed to its cracking in the construction of the upper part of this pyramid. Small facing blocks were for the first time laid strictly horizontally, as would be done in the construction of all subsequent pyramids. Nevertheless, even assembled in such a complex and unaesthetic manner, the pyramid, about 106 meters high, turned out to be so strange and unprepossessing in appearance, with a sharp break in the faces at mid-height, that it was in no way suitable for the role of the majestic tomb of the perfect god Sneferu. This pyramid went down in history under the name bent, or rhomboidal pyramid. The exhausted and probably humiliated by failure architects and builders of Pharaoh Sneferu had no choice but to start all the gigantic work practically from scratch again. The construction of the unsuccessful bent pyramid, even though it was now useless for the king's own burial, was nevertheless decided to be continued and brought to completion. Perhaps, if left unfinished, it would have served as an eternal and shameful reminder of the failure and miscalculations of its creators. However, over time, the main efforts of the builders were clearly focused on careful preparation for the construction of a third gigantic pyramid for the indefatigable Sneferu, taking into account all the bitter lessons and past mistakes. For the new pyramid, a different section of the Dahshur Plateau was chosen, located about 2 kilometers north of the bent pyramid, this time with much stronger and more stable geological structures of the rock foundation. The angle of inclination of the faces of the new pyramid was immediately set at approximately 43 degrees, as gentle as it had been in the last upper stage of the bent pyramid's construction. And all stone blocks, both of the internal masonry and the external casing, were decided from the very beginning to be laid in strictly horizontal rows, which ensured much greater stability of the entire structure. Since the builders were clearly very limited in time, after all, Pharaoh Sneferu was no longer young and had probably been ruling for about 20 years by then, truly enormous human and material resources from all over the country were mobilized for the construction of this third, final pyramid. Sneferu had already reigned for 2 decades, which meant that his new House of Eternity had to be built and fully completed before the aging king himself died. Without wasting time, the royal builders, perhaps, also simultaneously decided to transform Sneferu's very first stepped pyramid at Meidum into a true, genuine pyramid with smooth faces, carefully casing it with additional stone masonry and a white limestone facing. Thus, in the last years of Sneferu's reign, incredibly intense construction work was carried out simultaneously on 3 different gigantic sites, at Meidum and on 2 sites at Dahshur, which unequivocally testifies to the simply unprecedented, unparalleled expenditure of resources and effort by the Egyptian state of that time. The construction of Sneferu's third northern Dahshur pyramid was carried out at a truly feverish, breakneck pace. If in the first 10 to 15 years of Sneferu's reign, when construction was mainly carried out only at Meidum, his masons laid an average of about 35,000 cubic meters of stone per year. Then, during the second decade of his reign, when the gigantic bent pyramid at Dahshur was being built in parallel, the average annual work rate more than doubled, to approximately 80,000 cubic meters of stone per year. In the third, final stage of his reign, when work was simultaneously carried out on 3 different sites, completion of the bent, construction of the red, and casing of the Meidum pyramids, the total rate of stone laying, according to expert estimates, must have reached absolutely fantastic figures for that time, on the order of 100 to 150,000 cubic meters of stone annually. It seems extremely unlikely that these incredible construction rates were ever exceeded in the subsequent history of Egypt, not even during the construction of Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, which was even larger in volume. It has been calculated that Sneferu's third and final pyramid, known today due to the characteristic pinkish hue of its main limestone masonry as the Red Pyramid, was completely built and finished in record short time, approximately only a decade and a half. Such incredible speed was possible not only due to the enormous concentration of resources, but also due to engineering solutions. The most difficult task in the construction of any pyramid, related to the need to lift millions of heavy stone blocks to ever-increasing heights, was solved here partly because, with the pyramidal form, the main volume of the structure is in its lower part, and towards the top it sharply decreases. Thus, for example, the first 11 of the 157 rows of stone masonry of the Red Pyramid already constitute 20% of its total volume. And when the ancient masons had laid 66 rows of masonry, that is, less than half of the total projected number of rows, they had actually completed 80% of all the stone-laying work. Thus, thanks to these truly breakneck paces and the colossal efforts of the entire state, the Red Pyramid was successfully completed on time, still during Sneferu's lifetime. The greatest pyramid builder in all of ancient Egyptian history finally received a tomb worthy of his ambitions and his new title of perfect god. It was this, the Red Pyramid, that was given the proud name, the shining structure of Sneferu, while the unsuccessful bent pyramid was named merely the southern shining structure of Sneferu. The Red Pyramid was not only perfect on the outside, becoming the first fully completed smooth pyramid of regular shape in history. It was no less perfect on the inside. Its internal chambers, located at the base of the pyramid, amaze with their exquisite architectural decoration and especially the elegant and innovative form of their high corbelled vaults, with a false keystone, which not only relieved the enormous unhunted pressure from the ceiling of the chambers, but also, by their shape, seemed to repeat and recall the pyramidal form of the entire structure as a whole. Two of the three main internal chambers are located at ground level, in the very core of the pyramid, while the third, the main burial chamber, in which the sarcophagus with the mummy of the king himself was probably to be buried, was located somewhat higher, and a separate corridor led to it. Even in his death, the great pharaoh Sneferu was symbolically raised closer to the heavens, to the gods, than to the mortal earth. The era of the greatest show on earth had arrived, the construction of the pyramids at Giza. If Pharaoh Sneferu, through long and costly experiments and even failures, perfected the very technique of building true pyramids and prepared the necessary economic and administrative base for it, then his son and successor Khufu, or Cheops, raised this art to absolute, unsurpassed heights, creating a true masterpiece of engineering thought and architectural art. About how exactly this famous son of Sneferu ruled, we, unfortunately, know very little from contemporary sources, and even less about his personal life and character. We can only confidently assume that he grew up at his father's court, in the shadow of his grandiose construction projects, and under the strong influence of a kind of pyramid fashion or even arms race already existing at court. This probably determined his main life decision, to surpass his great father Sneferu at all costs, by building for himself a pyramid that would become an absolutely unique, unsurpassed, and eternal model of funerary architecture and a symbol of his own limitless power. Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, therefore, marked not only the very peak, the apogee in the technological and architectural evolution of royal funerary ideology in ancient Egypt, but also became the brightest expression of that tradition, characteristic of unlimited absolute monarchy, of embodying one's own greatness, power, and divinity in colossal, superhuman scale, monumental architecture. On the one hand, the very erection of such a gigantic structure meant the establishment of complete and total control of central authority over the entire economic, political, and social life of the country, over its resources and population. And on the other hand, it became a completely unique, unrepeatable, and in many ways enigmatic event in all of human history. It was from this unique combination of all-pervading divine authority, inspiring reverent awe, and unprecedented external material splendor that the famous Pyramid of Khufu was born in all its enduring and endless charm. In erecting the Great Pyramid, its builders were clearly guided by completely new, even higher standards of quality, precision, and monumentality, which would remain unsurpassed in the subsequent history of pyramid building. Pharaoh Khufu chose the site for his future House of Eternity with extreme care. It turned out to be a hitherto virtually pristine rock plateau in the area now known as Giza, located somewhat north of Dahshur and Saqqara, but still within sight of the capital, Memphis. This location had several significant advantages. Firstly, the pyramid was to rest on a very solid and level limestone base, part of the geological formation of Mount Mokattam. This foundation was capable of withstanding the monstrous weight of the future gigantic structure, which was about 6 million tons. Secondly, among other important advantages of the chosen site was the presence right there on the Giza plateau itself of huge and easily accessible reserves of building stone. Limestone of quite decent quality, which could be quarried on the spot, significantly simplifying logistics, as well as its relative accessibility for the delivery of higher quality-facing limestone from the Tura quarries on the other bank of the Nile and heavy granite from distant Aswan by water, especially during the annual Nile flood, thanks to which large cargo boats could freely approach via specially dug canals right up to the very foot of the plateau. With the same diligence and responsibility, King Khufu approached the choice of the person who was to lead this entire, grandiose and most complex construction project. As we have already noted, during the Fourth Dynasty, the highest and most responsible positions in state administration were, as a rule, no longer occupied simply by professional officials, but by the closest and most trusted members of the royal family itself, sons, brothers, nephews of the pharaoh. This probably indicates conscious attempts by the pharaoh to further concentrate all power in his own hands and those of his family, completely controlling all key posts. Therefore, for the most important and ambitious enterprise of his entire reign, the construction of the Great Pyramid, Khufu chose as chief architect and manager of all works the most trusted person from among his closest relatives. This man was Hemiunu. In all likelihood, he was the ruling pharaoh's nephew, the son of his brother Nefermat. Undoubtedly, this very blood proximity to the king opened the way for him to rapid advancement in service. But only thanks to his high professionalism, organizational skills, and, probably, an extraordinary mind, was he able to make this advancement so swiftly and occupy the highest posts in the state. At the peak of his brilliant career, Hemiunu simultaneously held many of the most important courtly, religious, and administrative positions, having traveled an impressive path from senior over the royal chamber to high priest of the god Thoth, Sneferu, god of writing, wisdom, and accounting. Among Hemiunu's numerous titles, listed in his tomb, the rank of steward of the musicians of the north and south appears quite unusual and intriguing, which perhaps reflects his personal passion for music or his responsibility for organizing court ceremonies. However, titles such as Chief of the Royal Scribes, which, in other words, meant head of the entire civil administration of the country, and especially overseer of all royal works, were directly related to the highest state administration and presupposed an extreme degree of responsibility and trust on the part of the pharaoh. Of all the numerous royal works that Hemiunu supervised, the matter of absolutely paramount importance for Pharaoh Khufu was, of course, the construction of his own Great Pyramid. It was Hemiunu, as chief vizier and overseer of all works, who was absolutely responsible for all aspects of this gigantic enterprise. From the supply of food and materials for tens of thousands of workers, the organization of their labor and daily life, the management of the quarrying and delivery of millions of stone blocks, the construction of complex building ramps and mechanisms, to the direct supervision of the activities of numerous surveyors, architects, engineers, and overseers on the construction site itself. The magnificently preserved and very realistic life-size statue of Hemiunu, found in his own huge mastaba at Giza, depicts this man in the full plenitude of his power and satisfaction with his position. His portliness and the massiveness of his figure unequivocally emphasize his enormous wealth and exceptionally privileged position in the society of that time. And the characteristic aquiline features of his intelligent and imperious face, high forehead, and strong, resolute jaw clearly indicate his firm, willful, and decisive character. These personal qualities were undoubtedly much more necessary to him than his close family ties to the royal house, when he first stood on the desolate and rocky Giza plateau at the very beginning of his uncle Khufu's reign, fully aware of the grandiose scale and incredible difficulties of the work ahead of him. The first stage of the Great Pyramid's construction, in many respects the most important and decisive for the entire subsequent success of the enterprise, included meticulous preparatory and extremely complex design work. First of all, it was necessary to orient the future gigantic structure to the cardinal points with incredible precision. The astonishing accuracy with which the faces of Khufu's pyramid are directed to true north, south, east, and west, with an error of less than 3 arc minutes, still causes surprise and debate about the methods used by ancient Egyptian surveyors. The most probable explanation is that the ancient builders oriented themselves not by the sun, whose position changes throughout the year, but by the position of the stars in the night sky, since orientation by the sun would have resulted in a much larger error. Although the specific technique of their ancient astronavigation is not fully known, it can be assumed with a high degree of certainty that it was based on the precise observation of the culmination or simultaneous position on the same vertical of 2 bright stars in the circumpolar region of the northern hemisphere sky, which never set below the horizon. When these 2 stars are exactly on the same vertical line, which is easily checked with a primitive but accurate instrument, a plumb line, this line indicates the direction of true astronomical north. One can only guess with what great solemnity and observance of complex rituals, probably in the presence of the chief architect Hemiunu himself and even Pharaoh Khufu, the priest astronomers conducted this most important ceremony of founding the pyramid and accurately determining its orientation. For on this, according to the deep religious beliefs of the Egyptians, directly depended the magical power of the future pyramid as a resurrection machine for the deceased king. Its ability to unite his soul with the eternal stars and ensure his posthumous rebirth, as we shall see later when discussing the internal shafts. Once the main construction site for the pyramid was accurately marked out according to the cardinal points, it had to be thoroughly cleared of loose rock and perfectly leveled horizontally, a task no less complex given the enormous dimensions of the base, 230 meters in length and width. The ancient Egyptians probably solved this problem using a brilliantly simple method. They cut a shallow network of intersecting right-angled channels into the rock foundation, then filled them with water, and by its level, determined and cut away all irregularities in the rock. After completing all these preparatory works, the builders finally proceeded directly to the erection of the gigantic pyramid itself. Today, such a project seems almost incredible in its audacity and scale, but it apparently hardly discouraged the ambitious Pharaoh Khufu and his experienced engineers, relying on a powerful state machine, the accumulated experience of previous pyramid creators, especially Sneferu, and virtually unlimited resources of the entire country. If any enterprise required significant and coordinated efforts from the Egyptians, they usually applied their favorite method, dividing the entire complex process into a series of smaller, simpler, and more manageable elements or stages. Such a systematic and hierarchical approach fully justified itself also in the construction of a gigantic pyramid, when it was necessary to effectively organize and control the labor of a huge number of workers. The basic organizational unit on the construction site, as finds in the builders' villages show, was apparently the work gang, consisting of about 20 men, headed by an experienced senior worker, a foreman. Such a small size of the gang inevitably fostered a spirit of camaraderie, mutual assistance, and corporate solidarity within it, and also stimulated healthy, friendly competition between different gangs in an effort to meet and exceed the daily quota, to surpass each other in speed and quality of work. Judging by the surviving inscriptions and graffiti of the workers themselves, this was also the case with larger units of labor. 10 such gangs of 20 men were combined into a larger unit of 200 men, which today is conventionally known by the Greek term phyles. 5 such phyles, each of which had its own unique name, often related to the name of the pharaoh or some god, and was headed by its own chief or overseer, in turn were combined into an even larger detachment numbering about 1,000 workers. And 2 such thousands, which also had their own names, often quite jocular and informal, such as Drunkards of Menkaure or Friends of Khufu, constituted the largest known structural unit in pyramid construction, conventionally called a crew or side, right and left. Such a clear pyramidal organization of the entire huge mass of workers on the construction site symbolically reflected the very form of the grandiose monument they were all building together. Just like modern regiments, battalions, and companies in an army, this system not only ensured effective management and control, but also developed in the workers a strong sense of collective pride in their unit and their work, and also stimulated corporate belonging at different levels of the system, striving to be the best and to achieve recognition and encouragement from superiors. Each link in this complex system constantly competed with another. Gang competed with gang, phyle with phyle, and thousand with thousand. Such a simple, yet at the same time quite ingenious organizational solution was perfectly suited for solving this extremely complex engineering and logistical task, and ensured constant motivation and high labor productivity of a huge mass of people for many years. High motivation in this matter was indeed very important. The construction of Khufu's gigantic pyramid, according to expert estimates, lasted almost his entire reign, that is, about 20 years. And these were 20 long years of continuous, extremely exhausting, and very dangerous physical labor for tens of thousands of people. Particularly harsh and unfavorable were the working conditions in the main quarry, located at the southern foot of the Giza Plateau, only a few hundred meters from the pyramid under construction itself. One can imagine this scene: huge clouds of suffocating white limestone dust rising from the blows of thousands of hammers and chisels, the dazzling, unbearable light of the scorching Egyptian sun repeatedly reflecting off the white slopes of the quarry, the continuous deafening clang of countless stone and copper tools, the shouts of overseers, a swarm of annoying flies attracted by sweat and food, and the heavy, suffocating smell of thousands of unwashed human bodies crowded into a limited space. Such working conditions can hardly be called easy or pleasant. Here, in this stone inferno, the most inexperienced newcomers, just herded to the construction site from all over the country, probably worked off their labor dues, forced to perform the heaviest and dirtiest work in hopes of promotion or a speedy return home. But the alternative to grueling work in the quarry itself was, perhaps, not much better. Transporting millions of huge stone monoliths from the quarry to the pyramid construction site, over a distance of several hundred meters, and with a constant upward incline, also required truly superhuman efforts and the coordinated work of hundreds of people. Each stone block weighing at least a ton, and often 2 or 3 tons, was first lifted from the quarry with enormous effort, using wooden levers and ropes, onto special sturdy wooden sledges. Then, these heavily laden sledges were pulled by entire teams of workers using thick palm fiber ropes along a carefully leveled and constantly wetted with water or liquid clay ramp road leading to the pyramid. After delivering the block to its immediate construction site, It was again removed from the sledges with levers and shims, and then very carefully and precisely placed in its position in the masonry, meticulously preparing it for final dressing and fitting to adjacent blocks. However much Khufu's Great Pyramid astounds us with its gigantic dimensions and seeming implausibility, it was, undoubtedly, made by the hands of mere mortals and was quite within the capabilities of the ancient Egyptians, even with their relatively simple but effective level of technical capabilities and excellent labor organization. Modern calculations and numerous practical experiments in reproducing ancient technologies convincingly prove that for the quarrying, transportation, and placement of more than 2 million huge stone blocks, and that is how many, according to estimates, were required for the construction of the Great Pyramid itself. A permanent workforce of only 2 double crews, or about 4,000 to 5,000 professional stonemasons and builders, was quite sufficient. Approximately the same number of unskilled workers could have been simultaneously employed to lay wide and sturdy ramp roads from the quarry to the pyramid, as well as for the construction and constant raising of huge construction ramps or causeways around the pyramid itself, along which the stone blocks were lifted as it was being built. Another huge army of auxiliary workers and artisans had to work tirelessly to support this entire complex and continuous construction process at all its stages. Carpenters had to constantly make and repair numerous wooden sledges, levers, and props. Thousands of water carriers had to continuously wet the surface of the earthen or log-lined construction ramps to reduce friction when dragging the sledges. Potters had to mass-produce not only jars for water carriers, but also all other necessary ceramic vessels for storing, preparing, and consuming food by thousands of workers. Blacksmiths and coppersmiths had to constantly repair and sharpen thousands of rapidly wearing copper tools, chisels, saws, drills, with which stone was quarried. And entire armies of bakers, brewers, and cooks had to daily feed and water this entire huge mass of people. But even taking into account all these auxiliary services, according to the most generous estimates of modern specialists, no more than 10,000 to 20,000 people could have simultaneously worked and been on the construction site of the Great Pyramid at Giza at any one time. The figure of 100,000 workers, cited by Herodotus, is a clear exaggeration. At the very site of the grandiose construction at Giza, as excavations of recent decades show, only a relatively small permanent contingent of highly skilled workers lived year-round with their families. These were professional stonemasons, surveyor-engineers, architect-builders, skilled artisans, and, of course, administrators and overseers. The overwhelming majority of the entire huge workforce required to perform the heaviest and most unskilled jobs, such as quarrying and transporting stone, consisted, apparently, of seasonal workers. These were ordinary Egyptian peasants who were conscripted for state labor service for several months a year, usually during the Nile flood, when agricultural work in the valley ceased. After completing their service, they returned to their villages and families. The so-called Pyramid Town, or City of the Builders, recently discovered and excavated by archaeologists, located south of the Giza pyramids, where these ordinary workers lived, has preserved for us extremely interesting and unique details of their daily life, customs, and labor organization. The main settlement of these builders, conventionally called Gerget Khufu, meaning settlement of Khufu, was located, apparently somewhat lower, closer to the arable lands of the Nile Valley, next to Pharaoh Khufu's own valley temple. A huge mountain of broken pottery, numerous traces of hearths and campfires, as well as a gigantic quantity of domestic animal bones, primarily cows, sheep, and goats, found during the excavations of this settlement, unequivocally testify to the once bustling economic activity here, the main purpose of which was to feed several thousand workers employed in construction daily. Under the subsequent Fourth Dynasty kings, Khafre and Menkaure, an even larger and well-planned pyramid town, sometimes called the Galleries, grew south of Giza, at the foot of the plateau. This also attests to careful state planning and excellent organization of the entire pyramid construction process. This workers' town was surrounded by a massive stone wall about 9 meters high and wide at the base. Its internal layout, with long rows of standard residential blocks, indicates a rigid hierarchical organization of living and labor, which mirrors the very pyramid of management of the entire workforce that we discussed earlier. Ordinary workers slept here in very Spartan and cramped conditions. Simple hard earthen or brick bunks, placed along the walls of long and narrow communal barracks, served as their beds. Each such barrack was a long, narrow structure with several small rooms, and was designed to house about 20 workers, that is, one standard work gang. In the rear, somewhat separate part of each such barrack, there was usually a more spacious and comfortable room where, apparently, their immediate superiors, overseers or foremen, lived. The chief overseer or manager of the entire settlement, who daily supervised the work process on the pyramid construction site itself, lived in even more comfortable conditions, in a separate, spacious house with an inner courtyard. Next to the residential barracks was a large open hall with wooden columns, which, apparently, served as a common dining hall for the workers. The organization of communal meals was intended not only to simplify the process of food distribution, but also to help strengthen team spirit and camaraderie among workers from different gangs. Workers engaged in such heavy physical labor as moving multi-ton stone blocks undoubtedly required abundant and protein-rich food to restore their strength. To diversify their main diet, which probably consisted of bread, beer, and dried fish, about 11 head of cattle and about 30 sheep and goats were slaughtered daily in this workers' city, according to zoo archaeologists, the meat of which went to feed the builders. In addition, tens or even hundreds of workers were constantly engaged in baking huge quantities of bread and brewing beer from barley, which formed the very basis of the ancient Egyptians' daily ration and was issued as pay. Grain, as the most important and strategic food product, was issued to the workers, apparently, in strictly measured portions under the careful control of the administration. The huge state granaries themselves, where grain reserves for the entire construction site were stored, were located within a separate royal administrative complex on the outskirts of the workers' city, and, for additional security and control, were surrounded by a strong double wall. Despite all this visible state care for the workers' nutrition and living arrangements, as well as the undoubted cohesion and pride of the builders themselves in their work, none of them ever forgot for whom and for what purpose they were working. There, perhaps the most important, most intriguing, and most controversial question related to Khufu's Great Pyramid, which has concerned people for more than 1 millennium, arose around its true purpose and the objective of its construction. What was the main motivating factor for the construction of such an incredible monument, colossal from an architectural, engineering, economic, and administrative point of view? Why did 10 or even 20,000 people for 20 whole years build this artificial stone mountain with the sweat of their brow, the equal of which has not been and is not on Earth? Most modern Egyptologists, as a rule, explain this phenomenon primarily by the unique and all-pervading ideology that dominated Egyptian society of the Old Kingdom, the ideology of the divine cult of the king. That is, the central idea was that the ruling pharaoh was not just a man, but a living god on earth, the sole and irreplaceable intermediary between the world of men and the world of gods, the main protector of the world order Ma'at established by the gods, and the sole guarantor of the stability, prosperity, and very existence of the country of Egypt. With such a worldview system, as proponents of this viewpoint believe, the main mass of the population quite voluntarily and even enthusiastically went to build the gigantic royal tomb, viewing it not as a heavy burden, but as their sacred duty, as an opportunity to serve their god-king and thereby express their deep respect, devotion, and ensure his benevolence and patronage both in life and after death. By participating in the construction of the pyramid, the subjects, as it were, entered into an unspoken social contract with their lord, ensuring him eternal life and power in the afterlife. And he, in turn, guaranteed them order, prosperity, and protection from chaos. Such an idealistic point of view undoubtedly has a right to exist and is supported by some indirect data. Yes, indeed. The construction of the pyramid was, in a certain sense, also a kind of social protection system, as it provided work and sustenance for a huge number of people for many years, especially during the period of the year when the annual Nile flood inundated the fields and made agricultural work impossible. Yes, indeed. The workers on the pyramid construction sites, as excavations of their settlements show, were fully provided by the state with housing and quite good food by ancient standards, and they, contrary to popular opinion based on biblical stories and Hollywood films, were definitely not slaves in the classical sense of the word, but rather seasonal workers performing labor service. Yes, undoubtedly, overseers and officials constantly instilled in newcomers the idea of the great honor and importance of the sacred work they were performing for their god-king. But other, no less weighty facts and archaeological evidence available to us indicate that the pyramid builders worked in extremely harsh, exhausting, and dangerous conditions, and this work itself had for most of them a clearly compulsory, obligatory character within the framework of state labor service. When royal officials and scribes appeared in an Egyptian village to conduct a census of the population and recruit young and healthy men for state service, the local population hardly greeted them with joy and enthusiasm. Most likely, this caused fear and attempts to evade. Injuries, as studies of skeletal remains from the cemeteries of pyramid builders show, were very frequent, almost inevitable companions of workers on the Giza Plateau. The skeletons found there bear numerous traces of severe bone fractures, serious degenerative pathologies of the spine, especially the lumbar region, and joints, caused by grueling physical labor and carrying heavy loads. Fatal accidents during dangerous work of quarrying, transporting, and laying multi-ton stone blocks were also undoubtedly not uncommon. However, official ancient Egyptian reports and inscriptions, if they were kept, predictably completely silence the real figures of those killed and maimed on this grandiose construction of the Great Pyramid. Thus, the construction of Khufu's pyramid, despite all its ideological significance, was by no means that great popular undertaking in which the entire population of the country allegedly voluntarily, joyfully, and proudly participated out of love for their pharaoh. But in that case, what was it really? The answer, probably, is much simpler, although somewhat unpalatable for admirers of the greatness of ancient Egypt. It was above all an undisguised, extremely frank, and absolutely overwhelming demonstration of the unlimited, total power of one ruler over the entire country, over all its resources, and over the life and death of all its inhabitants. From time immemorial, all tyrants and autocrats in all times and in all cultures, for some reason, have been particularly attracted to colossal, gigantic, superhuman-scale construction projects, which were intended to symbolize their personal greatness and the eternity of their rule. And Pharaoh Khufu's Great Pyramid, despite all its mathematical perfection and engineering genius, unfortunately serves as another, perhaps the earliest and most striking, illustrative example of such megalomania, the ruling despot's mania for grandeur. It is not surprising that its crowned builder Khufu, despite all his possible merits in strengthening the state, earned among later descendants, including the Greek historian Herodotus, the reputation of a cruel, arbitrary tyrant, mercilessly oppressing his people and disregarding human lives for the sake of satisfying his vanity. Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BCE, visited Egypt and collected local traditions there. states bluntly that Pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops, plunged the country into an abyss of calamities. First of all, he ordered all sanctuaries to be closed, and forbade the people to offer sacrifices. Then he forced all Egyptians without exception to work for him on the construction of the pyramid. And Herodotus further adds that the Egyptians hate these kings, that is, Khufu and his heir Khafre, so much that they only mention their names with great reluctance. The symbolic power and aura of absolute authority emanating from the Great Pyramid did not escape the attention of some dictators of the recent past either. As is well known, during his famous Egyptian campaign in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, at the head of his army, specifically went to Giza and set up his camp at the very foot of the plateau, right in front of the pyramids. Here, according to tradition, he addressed his soldiers with the famous and very significant words, "Soldiers, 40 centuries of history look down upon you from the height of these pyramids. And yet, the Great Pyramid is not just a symbol of monumental indestructibility and despotic power. What makes it truly unique and enigmatic is the unparalleled technical perfection for its time, and the astonishing complexity of its internal structure, still not fully understood. The incredible, almost supernatural meticulousness and precision with which its ancient creators managed to orient its gigantic base to the cardinal points has already been mentioned. However, perhaps the most surprising and enigmatic thing about the entire Great Pyramid is the presence inside it not of one, but of 3 burial chambers, located at different levels, and especially the existence of narrow, upward-sloping shafts that extend from the 2 upper chambers, the so-called King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber, and run towards the outer faces of the pyramid. These mysterious shafts, with a square cross-section of only about 20 centimeters on a side, pierce through the entire gigantic thickness of the pyramid's stone masonry, but they originally had no exit to the outside and ended in a dead end with small stone doors not far from the outer surface of the faces. Although these strange shafts have been inaccurately and clearly erroneously termed ventilation shafts in popular literature, today it seems absolutely obvious and more probable to most serious researchers that their true purpose goes far beyond any purely utilitarian, constructional, or ventilating needs. The fact is that, as precise astronomical calculations have shown, these 4 narrow shafts were by no means randomly oriented, but were directed with great accuracy towards specific important stars or sections of the night sky, as they were visible from Giza during the pyramid's construction era, that is, about 2,500 years BCE. 2 shafts emerging from the King's Chamber were oriented to the north, towards the then pole star, Thuban in the constellation Draco, and to the south, towards Orion's belt, which the Egyptians associated with the god Osiris. And 2 shafts from the Queen's Chamber were directed to the north, towards the stars of the constellation Ursa Minor, and to the south towards the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, or Sothis, which was associated with the goddess Isis and whose heliacal rising heralded the beginning of the Nile flood and the new year. The ancient Egyptians were excellent and very observant astronomers, and stars played an extremely important role in their religion, mythology, and especially in that part concerning beliefs about the posthumous fate and eternal existence of the deceased pharaoh. Particular attention and veneration were given to the circumpolar stars of the northern sky. They are constantly visible in the night sky of Egypt. They never set below the horizon, as if eternally revolving around the fixed point of the celestial pole. Therefore, they were perfectly suited to serve as a visible metaphor and symbol of the eternal, incorruptible, and unchanging fate of the deceased and deified king. His soul was to ascend to these indestructible stars and take its eternal place among them in the great cosmic order of the universe, which exists forever. Thus, Khufu's Great Pyramid, with its unique star shafts, was, in all probability, not just a gigantic tomb, but a most complex and multifunctional resurrection machine, a magical instrument designed to help the soul of the deceased pharaoh ascend to heaven and unite forever with the eternal stars, thereby ensuring not only his personal immortality, but also the enduring prosperity and stability of all Egypt, inextricably linked with its divine ruler. The ideology of the Son of Ra and the further development of the sun cult became defining for subsequent rulers of the Fourth Dynasty and the entire Old Kingdom. The Giza pyramids became not just tombs, but also a visible embodiment of the pharaoh's connection with the cosmos, especially with the sun and stars. The country's submission to the pharaoh's will, as already noted, grew, and this was reflected in the funerary practices of the elite. More and more tombs of courtiers and officials appeared around the royal burial site, arranged hierarchically, depending on their closeness to the king in life. Among representatives of the ruling elite, the custom of depicting themselves in tombs as humble scribes became widespread, emphasizing their devotion to the pharaoh's service and their dependence on him. This culture of emphasized service found its further development in autobiographical texts on tomb walls, which became increasingly detailed and standardized. It is no coincidence that precisely at the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty, one of the longest and most formalized standard funerary formulas appears, known as Hetep Dinesu, meaning an offering which the king gives. Numerous inscriptions applied to the walls of mortuary temples of nobles, on their false doors, offering tables, and later on sarcophagi, constantly emphasized that both the richness of the funerary equipment and the very possibility of having a lavish and eternally provided for funerary cult for the deceased through special funds were not his personal merit or right, but exclusively a generous royal gift, graciously bestowed upon him by the pharaoh for his loyal and impeccable service during life. Another indirect but very indicative piece of evidence of the unprecedented growth of the ruler's authority and sacred status in this era is the appearance and wide popularity among the population of personal names, in which, as the main theophoric, that is, divine element, not only the names of traditional great gods of the Egyptian pantheon, such as Ptah, Ra, or Horus, but also the name of the reigning king himself began to be increasingly included. A person who at birth was named, for example, Khufu Khaf, meaning Khufu is or shines, probably could himself quite sincerely wonder whether there was any fundamental difference at all between his earthly king and the great sun, god Ra. And in the monumental temple architecture of that time, this boundary between the divine and the royal indeed blurs almost completely. The layout and decoration of the mortuary temples of the Fourth Dynasty pharaohs themselves were often modeled on the temples of the main state gods and sometimes even surpassed them in size, richness of decoration, and architectural perfection. All these profound changes occurring in ideology, art, religion, and funerary rites in the relations between the pharaoh and his subjects unequivocally indicate a further, unprecedented strengthening and absolutization of royal power during the Fourth Dynasty. This is supported not only by such a visible and overwhelming symbol of this power as the gigantic Giza Plateau itself with its pyramids, but also by the fact of a significant expansion of the real geographical borders and spheres of influence of the Egyptian kingdom during this period. Pharaoh Khufu and his immediate successors did not sit idly by in their luxurious capital, Memphis, but continued to actively organize distant and difficult military and trade expeditions to the most remote corners of the world known to them. The memory of these expeditions, testifying to the power and wide interests of Egypt at that time, has been preserved to this day in the form of few but very important rock inscriptions and reliefs, left by their participants both among the gloomy and arid mountains of the Sinai Peninsula to the northeast, where the Egyptians continued to actively mine copper and precious turquoise, and on a distant lonely rock in the Dakhla Oasis, located deep in the Libyan desert southwest of the Nile. Valley. The main goal of these distant and often very dangerous state campaigns was, of course, not so much territorial expansion itself, or the conquest of new lands, as primarily the extraction or acquisition through controlled trade of rare and precious natural resources, primarily various beautiful stones and valuable metals. These exotic materials were then used by skilled court artisans in royal workshops to inlay and decorate gigantic cult statues of gods and kings, to make exquisite and complex jewelry for the royal family and high nobility, as well as to produce other expensive luxury and prestige items designed to visibly emphasize the immense wealth, limitless power, and divine authority of the king himself and his court. A vivid and even somewhat shocking example of this incredible courtly luxury, sometimes bordering on outright decadence and excess against the backdrop of the general relative poverty of the main mass of the population, can be two unique private burials, accidentally excavated by archaeologists in the immediate vicinity of Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. The first tomb, very small in size but carefully built and decorated, belongs to a dwarf named Pernianku. This man, judging by his titles and depictions in the tomb, served at the pharaoh's court and, in all probability, entertained the king himself and numerous members of his family with his songs, dances, and jokes. He was a kind of ancient Egyptian, court jester or dwarf dancer, valued for his exoticism. The very noteworthy fact that even such an apparently insignificant and dependent character was удостоен великой чести быть похороненным в собственной каменной гробнице рядом с гигантской пирамидой самого великого царя, honored with the great. Distinction of being buried in his own stone tomb next to the gigantic pyramid of the greatest king himself already tells us a lot about the specifics of court life of that era. One can easily imagine what noisy, abundant, and luxurious feasts with music, dances, and rivers of wine this godlike ruler organized in his huge palace in Memphis, while thousands of his subjects, builders of his eternal pyramid, after a whole day of exhausting and dangerous labor, went to sleep on hard earthen bunks in their cramped and stuffy mud brick hovels in the nearby workers' village. In the second, much more important and famous tomb, or rather in a hidden cache beneath it, discovered by the American archaeologist George Reisner in 1925 completely by chance at the eastern foot of Khufu's pyramid, unique and magnificently preserved items of funerary furniture and various utensils were found belonging to the mother of King Khufu himself, the powerful and influential queen named Hetepheres I. This sensational find, which became one of the greatest in the history of Egyptology, sheds a bright and unique light on the incredibly luxurious and, at the same time, strangely enough, very mobile lifestyle of the Fourth Dynasty rulers themselves. Queen Hetepheres I was a very noble lady of the highest lineage. She was the chief wife of one great pyramid builder, Pharaoh Sneferu, the mother of another, even greater builder, Pharaoh Khufu, and, very likely, she herself was the daughter of the previous Third Dynasty king Huni. She was undoubtedly surrounded by truly royal, unsurpassed luxury, fully befitting her exceptionally high status in the state. For example, from one palace or residence to another, this powerful queen apparently traveled in a luxurious, completely gold-leafed wooden palanquin, carrying chair, with elegant carved panels of precious imported black ebony wood. A long hieroglyphic inscription on this palanquin, elegantly executed in golden hieroglyphs on a black background, reads, "Mother of the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, companion of Horus, preceptor of the king, that gracious one whose instructions were always carried out." If we are to believe these lavish and clearly official epithets, it seems that only the all-powerful and revered Queen Mother, Hetepheres herself, had real power and influence over her divine son, Pharaoh Khufu. Other unique items of exquisite furniture found in Queen Hetepheres' secret burial also suggest her frequent moves with the royal court from one residence to another throughout the country. For example, her elegant traveling bed, with a removable lightweight wooden canopy for protection from insects, and two low but very comfortable and elegantly shaped armchairs, were specially made extremely light and portable so that they could be easily and quickly disassembled into their component parts, using a system of tenons and mortises, and then easily transported to a new location and reassembled. The amazing simplicity and conciseness of forms, and at the same time the highest quality and exquisiteness of execution of this unique royal furniture, the unsurpassed skill of ancient Egyptian joiners and cabinet makers who used the most complex and perfect techniques of joining parts for that time without a single nail, and, of course, the very expensive imported and local materials, gold leaf, ebony wood, ivory, once again vividly emphasize the enormous self-confidence, restrained but absolute luxury, and impeccable artistic taste characteristic of the Fourth Dynasty era. The most expensive and indicative items in terms of the Queen's personal wealth from her entire richest funerary inventory were her elegant wooden caskets for storing numerous personal jewels. One such casket, made of cedar wood, inlaid with ivory and ebony, was specially made to store 20 identical massive silver bracelets. It is interesting to note that on the back of her palanquin, Queen Hetepheres herself is depicted with 14 such bracelets, worn simultaneously on her right arm, which attests to the fashion of the time. In that distant era, silver, which had to be imported into Egypt from other countries, possibly from Asia Minor or the Aegean Islands, was valued in the Nile Valley even more than local gold, of which there was relatively much in Egypt itself and neighboring Nubia. These heavy silver bracelets of Queen Hetepheres were additionally decorated with fine and colorful inlay of multicolored semi-precious stones, blue turquoise, blue lapis lazuli, and red carnelian, in the form of elegant stylized butterflies, symbolizing, perhaps, rebirth and immortality. In short, Queen Hetepheres, judging by her unique tomb and its contents, must have fully corresponded to her highest position, and the striking image of a powerful African queen mother, of an omnipotent and godlike king of Egypt. Only death itself, as always, remained beyond the control of even the almighty Pharaoh Khufu. He died around 2525 BCE after more than 20 years of rule, and was buried with the incredible pomp and observance of most complex funerary ceremonies befitting his status and greatness in his gigantic and impregnable Great Pyramid at Giza. His eldest son and legitimate heir, Chephren, undoubtedly attended and played the main role in his grandiose farewell and funeral ceremony. However, Chephren, unlike his great father, and no less great-grandfather, Sneferu, seems to have not inherited their all-consuming passion for architectural gigantomania and monumental construction at all. He built for himself a royal pyramid of much more modest dimensions than Khufu's. Its base was about half the size, and moreover, as we already know, he chose a completely different new location for it. The rocky and remote Abu Rawash Plateau, located several kilometers north of Giza, on the northernmost border of the great Memphite necropolis. It seems he understood perfectly well that his pyramid, no matter how hard he tried, would never be able to compete in size, perfection, and historical glory with the gigantic pyramids already erected by his great ancestors at Giza and Dahshur, and therefore decided not even to try to enter into this hopeless architectural competition with them. But this unexpected transfer of the royal necropolis to Abu Rawash apparently had another, deeper religious and ideological underpinning. The fact is that very close to Abu Rawash, on the other, eastern bank of the Nile, was the ancient and extremely influential city of Hemiunu, known to the Greeks as Heliopolis. This was the main and most authoritative cult center of the supreme sun god Ra, whose image and complex solar theology, it seems, particularly fascinated and attracted Pharaoh Chephren. The bright, all-seeing, all-pervading, and life-giving light of the midday sun was perfectly suited to serve as the main and universal symbol of the new, even more powerful, absolute and universal monarchy of the Fourth Dynasty. And Pharaoh Chephren consciously and actively used this powerful and positive solar symbol to create and emphasize an even closer and more direct mystical connection between the earthly king and the supreme celestial deity, the sun god Ra. With the help of this new, actively promoted by him solar religion, he, perhaps, intended to achieve the same ideological effect, that is, the absolutization and sacralization of his power, that his father Khufu had achieved through overwhelmingly gigantic architecture. Even the throne name that this pharaoh adopted, Chephren, can be translated as "He, Ra, is steadfast," or "eternal as Ra," and it was in itself an official and completely unambiguous statement of his special connection, supremacy, and patronage from the sun god. Furthermore, as already noted, it was Chephren who was the first of all Egyptian kings to officially supplement his royal titulary with a new, then canonical, fifth title, calling himself Sa-Ra, meaning son of Ra. This was a decisive and extremely important ideological step, meaning not just some abstract connection of the pharaoh with the sun god, but his direct physical sonship, his descent from the supreme deity itself. This also meant a certain conscious ideological break with the most ancient royal tradition, dating back to pre-dynastic times, in which the absolute leading place in the legitimization of royal power was given to the falcon god Horus as the main patron and even an incarnation of the king himself. The new title, Son of Ra, emphasized a certain ideological independence of the Fourth Dynasty pharaohs from the most ancient past and their clear desire to establish a new, solar type of legitimization of the monarchy, directly linked to the statewide and increasingly popular cult of the god Ra from Heliopolis. Thanks to such active patronage from the central royal authority itself, the cult of the god Ra very soon became the most influential and widespread throughout the country. And this god himself definitively occupied a firm and dominant place at the head of the entire official Egyptian pantheon for many subsequent centuries, becoming the main state deity of the Old Kingdom. The two main and, it would seem, somewhat contradictory, principal trends in the development of royal ideology and practice of this time: on the one hand, the continuation of the tradition of building gigantic pyramids as a symbol of absolute, earthly power and the king's eternal life, and on the other hand, the ever closer and more direct connection of the pharaoh with the celestial sun, god Ra, paradoxically intertwined and reached their harmonious culmination under the next pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, Khafre, known to the Greeks as Chephren. Khafre was, in all probability, Chephren's younger brother, and reigned around 2500 BCE. Unlike his older brother, Chephren, he decided to return to the prestigious and already tradition-sanctified Giza Plateau for the construction of his pyramid, next to the gigantic pyramid of their common father, Khufu. Here, slightly southwest of the Great Pyramid, he began the construction of his own, the second largest pyramid at Giza. Pharaoh Khafre prudently chose the highest point of the rock plateau for it. This clever engineering solution allowed his pyramid, with a height of only 143.5 meters, that is, 3 meters lower than Khufu's pyramid, to visually appear even taller than its great neighbor, especially when viewed from the east, from the Nile Valley. What an amazing combination of formal filial respect for his father and unconcealed personal vanity and desire to surpass him, at least visually. From Khafre's pyramid eastward, towards the Nile Valley, led an impressive covered stone causeway nearly half a kilometer long. It connected the upper mortuary temple, located at the eastern foot of the pyramid itself, with the lower valley temple, built on the border with the arable lands of the valley, and probably serving as the ceremonial entrance to the entire funerary complex. The walls of this magnificently preserved granite valley temple of Khafre were entirely cased, both inside and out, with huge, perfectly fitted slabs of expensive and extremely hard-to-work red Aswan granite. This stone, with its rich red color and mirror-like sheen, was intended to evoke direct associations in visitors with the rising or setting sun, and thereby further enhance the solar character of the deified king's mortuary cult. The floor of the main inner hypostyle hall of this temple was paved with large slabs of bright white, almost translucent calcite, or Egyptian alabaster, symbolizing purity, light, and eternity. Along the walls of this majestic hall with powerful monolithic granite columns once stood 23 magnificent life-size royal statues of Khafre, carved from stone. They depicted the king in the idealized image of a young and strong ruler, majestically seated on a simple cubic throne, decorated with symbols of unified Egypt, intertwined lotus and papyrus plants. And behind the king's head, invisible to the viewer looking at the statue from the front, sat the sacred falcon god Horus, who gently embraced the royal nape with his outstretched wings as a sign of eternal divine patronage and protection. The material for these statues, unsurpassed in their quality and artistic level, was an extremely rare and very hard stone, gneiss diorite, a mineral of amazing beauty, dark green or almost black in color, with thin white veins and a characteristic banded structure. This precious stone was quarried in the only known location, situated very far away, in the Nubian desert, hundreds of kilometers southwest of Giza. All this architectural and sculptural splendor, the gleam of polished red granite and white alabaster, the strict rows of majestic statues of precious bluish-black stone, the mysterious play of light and shadow in the high colonnaded hall, enhanced, probably, also by specially designed and skillfully selected lighting through narrow light slits in the ceiling, was intended to produce an absolutely indelible, almost mystical and overwhelming impression on all visitors to the temple, instilling in them a sacred awe before the unearthly, divine majesty of Pharaoh Khafre. It is difficult to even imagine a more perfect, more harmonious, and more magnificent material embodiment of the very idea of Egyptian divine kingship. But even with this astounding architectural and artistic achievement, Pharaoh Khafre did not stop in his quest to immortalize his name and his divine status. He also ordered a completely unique and unprecedented work to be carried out: to transform a huge monolithic rock of natural origin, made of nummulitic limestone, which stood solitarily on the Giza plateau near his valley temple and the causeway leading to the pyramid, under the blows of thousands of copper chisels and stone hammers in the hands of skilled ancient Egyptian stonemasons and sculptors. This shapeless rock, in a few years of work, quickly transformed into the gigantic, largest monolithic statue in the world of a reclining lion with a human head, the world-famous Great Sphinx of Giza. The face of this colossal and enigmatic creature, more than 73 meters long and about 20 meters high, was, according to the overwhelming majority of modern Egyptologists, given a clear portrait resemblance to King Khafre himself, the builder of the second pyramid. The Great Sphinx, this silent and eternal guardian of the Giza necropolis, which faced strictly east, towards the point of sunrise on the days of the equinoxes, symbolized, in all probability, none other than King Khafre himself in the guise of the mighty morning sun god Ra-Harakti, that is, Ra-Horus of the two horizons, who victoriously rises on the eastern horizon, marking the beginning of a new day and victory over the forces of darkness and chaos. Thus, this silent and eternally enigmatic guardian of the Giza necropolis became not only the new and main visual and sacred landmark for the entire area around Khafre's pyramid complex, but also the final and most striking monumental expression of the new dominant solar ideology of the Fourth Dynasty. Khufu's second great son, Khafre, not only tried to surpass his father's gigantic but somewhat simpler Great Pyramid with his magnificent and harmonious funerary complex, but also, by creating the colossal Sphinx next to it, he effectively appropriated the entire sacred necropolis of Giza for himself, forever linking it in the consciousness of posterity precisely with his name and his image as the sun god. The incalculable human and material resources of the entire country, which during the lifetime of just 3 generations of Fourth Dynasty pharaohs, Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre, were ruthlessly and almost completely expended on the construction of their gigantic and super-expensive pyramid complexes at Meidum, Dahshur, and Giza, not only forever changed the physical and cultural landscape of Egypt, leaving an indelible mark on it, but also, in all probability, completely exhausted its economy and human resources. The last of the 3 great pyramids on the Giza Plateau, belonging to the 5th pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, named Menkaure, known to the Greeks as Mykerinos, he was Khafre's son and Khufu's grandson, is already distinguished by very modest, almost miniature dimensions compared to the gigantic tombs of its neighbors. Its height is only about 66 meters, or 216 feet, which is more than twice lower than the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre, and its total volume is less than 1/10 of the volume of Khufu's Great Pyramid. The ancient builders, it seems, tried their best to compensate for these relatively small dimensions of Menkaure's pyramid with the originality of its design and the special richness and quality of its finishing, using for the casing of its lower part about 1/3 of its height. Not the usual and easily accessible white Tura limestone, but extremely expensive and very hard to work, beautiful red Aswan granite. This granite had to be transported on special barges up the Nile for 1,000 kilometers from the very south of the country, from quarries in the area of the First Cataract. In addition, they significantly increased the relative size and complexity of the layout of Menkaure's mortuary temple, located at the eastern foot of his pyramid. In this temple, as numerous finds of magnificent royal statues of Menkaure, surrounded by gods and goddesses, the so-called Menkaure triads, as well as various inscriptions, show his posthumous mortuary cult continued to be actively and lavishly performed for several more centuries after his death, which may indicate his special posthumous popularity or the importance of his cult for subsequent dynasties. But the great era of building truly gigantic pyramids, the era of absolute power and, it would seem, limitless resources of the Fourth Dynasty pharaohs, had obviously, irretrievably passed. Henceforth, their successors, the kings of the Fifth and subsequent dynasties of the Old Kingdom, would have to seek other, less economically costly and, perhaps, more ideologically sophisticated ways to demonstrate their power and their divine status, such as the construction of sun temples or richly decorated tombs with pyramid texts. There is a well-known Arab proverb that is believed to perfectly reflect the uniqueness, grandeur, and timelessness of the Egyptian pyramids. It states, "All the world fears time, but time itself fears the pyramids." Pharaoh Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza was, undoubtedly, the most grandiose, most perfect, and most labor-intensive man-made structure of all antiquity. A true marvel of engineering thought and architectural art. Its royal owner undoubtedly left in his time, and in the subsequent history of mankind, the marks of a true giant, a titan, almost equal to the gods. However, by a twist of fate, the only absolutely authentic and fully preserved lifetime depiction of the great Pharaoh Khufu himself is a tiny, almost miniature statuette made of ivory, little more than a finger in size. In this fact, one can see a kind of bitter archaeological irony, or even a mockery of history at human vanity. This unique and priceless statuette was found completely by chance in the early 20th century by the famous British archaeologist Sir William Flinders Petrie during his excavations among the ruins of the ancient temple of the god Osiris in the distant Abydos, hundreds of kilometers from Giza. Its height is only about 3 inches, or 7.5 centimeters. Despite its tiny dimensions, an unknown ancient Egyptian sculptor managed with amazing skill, precision, and expressiveness to convey all the characteristic elements of the official image of this great king. Khufu is depicted seated on a simple cubic throne. He wears the red crown of Lower Egypt and holds the royal flail nekech in his right hand. But the miniature dimensions of this statuette itself are clearly not in keeping with the image of the mighty, formidable, and grandiose builder of the world's greatest pyramid that we usually imagine. A great despot in life and a cruel tyrant in the memory of later generations, Pharaoh Khufu was ultimately, as it were, diminished, reduced by history itself to the size of this tiny, almost imperceptible ivory statuette. Perhaps there is a deep historical justice and wisdom in this. The era of the Fifth Dynasty arrived, and new winds of change blew in Egypt, associated with the further strengthening of the cult of the sun god Ra from Heliopolis, who became the main state god. The apparent stability at first glance of the Pyramid Age was coming to an end, giving way to new challenges and transformations.